if you feel like you know the most out of the people in that team or about that topic, just say, okay, I'll go last, you guys go first, so everyone gets a chance to try and say their ideas, because often you'll get a different take on it, even if you've got the same one. Okay, then at 30 minutes you go into the debate. So first thing to do, as soon as you get given the topic, start thinking about it immediately. When people in your team are giving you ideas, listen patiently to it, because often you find a lot of valuable stuff. It's worthwhile acknowledging you're a team of 3, not just 1. Also be open to changing your mind. Your ideas might not be the best ones for that debate. And make sure you take thorough notes during that discussion time so you collect everyone's ideas. Always make sure you have someone keeping an eye on the time, or we can't start debates on time, or you won't have fleshed out speakers. Okay, I'll just run through this quickly. So this is how we think about case construction. This is obviously from a previous PowerPoint from a previous year where we ran this in the next week from now. Basically, the way that I like to think about debates where the affirmative side is trying to solve a problem. For example, you are imposing affirmative action quotas on company boards, for example. The first thing you need to do when you get that topic is figure out what the problem is there. Okay? So the problem probably in that debate is women are underrepresented in company boards. You might also know that it's like 11% of company boards are women. So there's your problem. Both sides will probably in that debate agree that that is a problem. They don't have to, but as the negative team challenging that problem, acknowledge will only ever say that it's a smaller problem and won't necessarily prove your case. In that kind of circumstance, it's kind of hard to prove. There's no problem, therefore we shouldn't have this debate. So then the debate becomes about the next 2 things you think about. The next thing you think about is what your solution is going to be. When it's given to you, like you're going to impose a quota for affirmative action, you kind of already have an idea of what that model looks like. You might want to think about how practically that would work a bit more and say something like, we would only impose this on companies that have at least 100 employees, or something like that to give it a bit of scale. So you're saying it's only the bigger companies that have a lot of people in them already have a pool of people to draw on. That's what we're going to narrow this debate to, so we don't have to deal with those practical problems. You're free to do that as long as there's kind of in the good spirit of the debate and you're not trying to make there be no debate. The final thing you want to think about is what your principle is in attacking that problem, right? So your principle in that affirmative action debate could simply be, as an affirmative team saying we're going to have quotas, be that there's been past oppression of women, and now what we're going to do is we stand for equality, we're just going to impose it, and that's how we're going to come about it. Or you might say the problem we have is a system that doesn't acknowledge the merit of women, so what we stand for is a meritocracy, but actually our meritocracy is better because we go against these disadvantages that are meaning that we're not getting the best applicants because we're not getting enough women. So 2 different ways you could come at it. You could probably come at both. Okay, what we're going to do now is talk about how to think about that case construction in a bit more depth in an actual debate. Okay, here we go. So first, why do you do individual prep first, at the very first thing? Individual prep is useful because you don't pollute the other people's ideas. What you should think about at the very first stage is, why are we having this debate? Like, why were the people in charge so crazy that they would set this as a topic? Then you're thinking about things like, what is the context? What is the imperative? What is the great reason for doing, being the affirmative in this motion? And thirdly, you're thinking, what is that problem that we have to solve? After you've done that, obviously you go through the solution. When we're talking about a solution here, we're talking about a number of concepts that if you've done in high school debating, you've probably seen before. So things like a definition and like a model. In university debating, we're a lot more casual about that, in that we don't want you to get up and just give the Oxford Dictionary definition of each word in the topic. That's less useful. We want to get into debating faster. So the purpose of a definition is anything that's ambiguous in that debate, just clear up so we can move on and have the debate. You're creating a model, a way of having that debate. If you're imposing an emissions trading scheme, you'd want a rough idea of what that emissions trading scheme is so that you can actually debate it. Otherwise, the debate would be about what your model is, and that's not as interesting. And the final thing is what your general stance is. So, in this debate, are you doing it because you believe in freedom and you're a libertarian? Are you doing it because you think it'll be the best social outcomes will come out of your model? Give some sort of indication of what your stance is in this debate. And that's useful for the debate kind of happening. So that kind of leads in nicely to who are we in this debate? What's our kind of core principles at which we're attacking it? Because there could be a whole range of kind of contradictory reasons that you would support a policy or a certain side of the debate. So it could simply be that you're saying you're supporting it from a circumstance of freedom, or you could be asking, you know, what would John Rawls say? How do we best help the most disadvantaged in our society? And that's your principle. Okay? We don't generally hark back to the philosophers when we're actually speaking, but feel free to take their ideas. Okay, so let's give some examples. In a debate on that we should legalise drugs, there are two very distinct approaches you could take. You could use both, but are often kind of contradictory when you're having a debate. So say you're the affirmative side on that we should legalise drugs. You could say that's purely from the kind of harm minimisation standpoint, right? You could be going, taking drugs is an issue of public health. It's not about individual choices. When people are taking drugs, they're not choosing to take drugs, and it's causing them harm. The government has a responsibility to them, so we should intervene and minimise that harm. Then you prove why this minimises that harm best, rather than treating those people like criminals. Or you could talk about it from the opposite circumstance. So it's not saying that they don't have choice so that we should help them from a health point of view, saying no, they have all the choice of the world. We should let heroin addicts take all the heroin they want because they chose it, and at the end of the day, they're responsible for their own choices, right? So there are two almost contradictory ways you can approach that debate that both argue for the same side. That's why it's important in prep to just think, why are we taking this side in this debate? Okay? Are you Ron Paul? Or why can't you be both? You could say both. You could say we believe in freedom, but we also think that maybe some addicted people aren't as free, we care about them as well. That's fine to do as well. Okay, as long as you're not being contradictory. Next on, say you were saying you support humanitarian intervention. Okay, there's a number of reasons you could support that. You could support it from a kind of standard of universal rights and cosmopolitanism, you know, like Gareth Evans, or you could kind of be Jed Bartlett, and I don't know, do it for improving international relations and just being a general great guy. Okay. The next thing you have to think about, and this is where it's getting a bit more complex, so don't expect this to do all of this in your first debate, especially if you haven't debated before. This is just to give you an idea of the kind of things you should be thinking about to lead to good debates, is what we like to call, in our kind of jargon, the clash. So that means, where do the arguments engage with each other? So there will be some things in some debates that you could argue very passionately about that just won't be argued against by the other side, right? So if you're arguing about giving humanitarian aid, and you spend your whole first speaker speech talking about how bad the conditions are in Uganda and why we should give aid to there, the negative side is probably not going to dispute that, okay? Maybe they could, but they're probably not going to say that conditions aren't bad there. Which means that a lot of your speech, you've wasted that time when you could be making arguments on what they're going to probably be arguing on. That doesn't mean anticipating their entire case, it just means maybe already taking into account that they might say we don't have the money for it. Okay, so making some argument why we absolutely do have the money for it, or making that argument about the situation being really bad in Uganda, rather than it just being really bad, saying our money would be better spent here than where we are, right? So when you're making the debate comparative like that, you're creating a clash there where they have to respond to that. Okay? So always be thinking in prep, especially as a third speaker, maybe where you're helping out your first and second speaker, what are going to be the key points of contention in this debate that we have to think about? Okay, think about, is the opposition going to be talking about one of those principles that we talked about before? Is the opposition going to be purely saying, this is a utilitarian case where we worry about outcomes? In that case, it's probably useful to not only make your libertarian argument for legalising drugs, but say, we believe in freedom, but even if you believe in the, maximising social outcomes that they want, we also win that as well. Yeah? So it's more persuasive if you try and think about how they're going to argue about it and engage with that as well. Obviously, this is all getting quite sophisticated, and you won't have to worry about that today, but it's worth thinking about. Okay, so the final thing you've done in prep, don't let this kind of broad picture stuff, as fun as it is, really go at your stage beyond 15 minutes. Simply because, a lot of you may not be that useful to speaking off bullet points. So we don't really use kind of the flashcards that we use in high school in university debating. Instead, we use kind of A4 sheets of paper and read from the desk. That means that it's even more important that you're not kind of reading and that you are speaking and trying to speak from dot points, because it'll be really obvious if you're reading down from your desk. So just give it a go. It's okay if you don't make it to time. We have speeches of 6 to 8 minutes. If you don't make it to that time, that's perfectly fine. It's more important to give kind of like a 4-minute speech of stuff that you're happy with saying than to just waffle for another 2 minutes repeating your points. So that's what I'd say on that. So when you get to listing your arguments, by this stage you've got a pretty good idea of what your ideas are in the debate. Some good ways of thinking of arguments is maybe the first couple will just kind of come to you intuitively. So the first couple you've thought, okay, so an obvious reason why we should legalize drugs maybe is you know the context of the war on drugs in America and you're saying this is leading into a massive black market that we want to stop. So one of your initial benefits could be if we take this into a legal system, we lose the harm of that illegality, right? The next thing you can think of is you're going, okay, so this is quite difficult. Who else is this benefiting? So one of the ways of thinking of arguments, if you can't think of them intuitively, is think through the stakeholders in that debate. Okay, so that's especially useful in thinking through the practical outcomes. So the next stakeholder you might think about is quite easily, you can talk about, one of the stakeholders in this debate will be drug addicts, right? So you can think about what happens if you legalise all drugs for drug addicts. Well, maybe in your model you've talked about how you'll give them free access to health clinics or something to get back on, back on the right track. So you can immediately say, okay, there's good health outcomes. That's another argument. You can flesh that out about how that proves your case. Then you're thinking, who else could this benefit? Well, we could tax these drugs, maybe. That's a benefit to government of the increased revenue that you get, which you could spend on those health outcomes, right? So you're creating a picture where you're thinking about each person, each stakeholder, each group of people in this debate, and how this model might affect them. It might be the case that there's some stakeholder that you won't win in that debate. Okay, so it might be the case that that there'll be new people who would, like if you think that drugs are bad and you're arguing that you want to minimise the harm of them, it may be the case that if you legalise all drugs, there will be more people taking ice and meth and heroin and dying because of that. Okay, or at least there will be some people who wouldn't have otherwise taken it. You probably could concede that you lose that stakeholder, right? You could argue with that, but it might be the case that you lose that and there will be some more people who take drugs down the line. What you then have to do is say why the people that you care about are more important than those people, or the harms accrued to those people are not as important as the harms that you've minimised for everyone else. So always try and be comparing the elements of the debate like that. Okay. The final thing to do is if you've kind of gone through the threat, you've got a killer team, you've come up with all your arguments, that's the point where you can maybe help your third speaker come up with your case. But the third speaker is going to have the whole of the debate to kind of sit there and look pretty and come up with arguments. So don't really worry about them as much. Worry about your first and second speakers. Okay. Okay, so we're doing a template, apparently. Okay, so this gives you a bit of an idea. Here's your 6 things you want to try and get through. You want to come up with a context, okay? Why are we having debate? Has something happened recently that's to do with this? If you were having an international relations debate about Russia, I would hazard a guess that Ukraine would be relevant, okay? So you've got a bit of context to the debate. Secondly, you're thinking about your imperative. Why is what we're told we have to argue for important? Second thing, you come up with a definition, so setting out the terms of the debate, what's going to be contested, what's not, and coming up with your practical model for it. Then coming up with your worldview as kind of, I like to say this more, I think it's more useful to think of rather than in libertarian and utilitarian terms, where philosophy students can get up and have a wank for 8 minutes. Rather than think about it in those terms, think about what do you want the world to look like? What's your end game, right? So in legalising all drugs, what's your end game? It's probably that these drugs are legal, they're managed by the government like alcohol and tobacco, and we just minimise the harm of them. That's your end game, you're pretty clear. If you're on the negative side, you probably also want to have a worldview, right? Your worldview will probably be, we want to catch all the cartels that are smuggling drugs across the borders and stop them from smuggling those harmful drugs, right? There's your end game. So that's a useful way to think about your worldview. Think about the clash of the debate, what's going to be argued. Then think about your arguments and try to come up with about 4 or 5. So you're probably giving 2 or 3 arguments to your first speaker, and then about 2 arguments to your second speaker, and then think about a bit of rebuttal. Okay, oh, here's what I was talking about, great. Okay, so you've thought about stakeholders. Think of some counterintuitive arguments. So think about what might be, what assumptions your arguments are kind of relying on. So that's where I was talking before about, like, are you arguing this in terms of thinking that individual choice is really important, or do you not think it's as important? That assumption, if you toy around with it, you can come up with new arguments because you're thinking about in a world where we have lots of choice or a world where we don't. Then think about the outcomes of your case. So if you're proposing a model that's pretty drastic, for example, say you were saying 50% of company boards had to be women. That was what you were arguing, right? Okay, you can make all the arguments for why that's a good thing, but maybe also important in that debate is how everyone in society who aren't perfect debaters like us think about it, right? How do they react to that? Is it good for the feminist movement if all these people backlash against the government who's proposing this model and making it less effective? Okay, so what's the way that will be perceived? Yeah, there's some other ideas. So long-term consequences, how it affects other countries, that kind of thing. Here are some arguments to avoid that are pretty common traps. The first common trap is saying, it's just wrong, okay? This one flies pretty well, unfortunately, in our democracy, but doesn't fly as well in our debating. So if you're having a debate on legalising incest, there's obviously a massive ick factor to incest at the outset, right? But you probably in a debate want to force yourself to try and think about reasons why it's wrong rather than just saying it's wrong at the outset. So if you're uncomfortable with rebuttal, often a really simple way to do some rebuttal of the other team's arguments is just to go, they said this, we think this is wrong because, and just give yourself a few becauses. Give yourself like 3 reasons at the bench that you've come up with why that argument is wrong and just step them through, and that's really useful. The next kind of a bit shabby argument is the model just won't practically work. So I think it's okay in a debate to have some reasons why the way of doing the policy that the other teams come up with is not that great, right? So it might be useful to say that, you know, in practice, if you're enforcing, say they didn't say that this was, that, you know, they were having 100 employees as the limit of their companies, it's probably not a very big point, but it might be worth noting that if you're enforcing on all companies to have a 50% quota, that there will be some companies, like self-employed people, won't be able to meet that, and it's a bit absurd in that sense. But that won't win you the debate. It's probably just going to score some points with you and the adjudicator going, yeah, okay, they didn't do a great job there. But don't focus on that as your debate. You want to prove why the reasoning behind it is wrong, okay? Yeah, so that's the other thing. So you can make good and reasonable arguments about whether the model is going to be effective, but probably don't nitpick. Even maybe that example about small companies isn't very relevant at all, and it's quite a bad point actually. So the final thing is, like, if you have to assassinate Mugabe, probably not such a useful argument to debate, even if you think it's really true to say Mugabe will just go into a concrete bunker and never surface again, so this debate doesn't occur in reality. Probably not useful for the debate to occur. It's probably okay to say it'd be difficult, but yeah. Okay, so that's everything I have. What I want to do now, before you guys get off,